Good evening. I'm Amy Burdos, the superintendent. I'd like to welcome you to our virtual town hall. We're so happy to have you join us this evening. I'd like to first start off by thanking Mike Weber at Foxborough Cable Access for setting this up for us and hosting. Joining me this evening are a number of panelists, our Assistant Superintendent, Dr. Mello, our Business Manager, Mr. Yukna, our Director of Student Services, Mr. Michael Lazik, our Director of Technology, Mr. Heyer, and then our principal at the Ahern Middle School, Ms. Frazier, and then Ms. Myers-Pakla, principal at the high school. So we're pleased to have all of them here with us. The purpose of this evening is to share some information with you. We do have the question and answer feature for questions. After each section that we talk about, we'll hopefully answer a number of questions that you might have. So you might want to hold some of those questions and see if they're not answered, but we'll stop at different sections to be able to answer them, so that way it's not overly congested, if you will. So please know that we're not going to be able to answer all of the questions this evening. It might be because we don't have the answers yet. And even next Wednesday, when we present the more detailed plan at the school committee, there still may be some answers that we're still waiting on, particularly when we think about athletics as an example. So again, this evening, the purpose is to be able to share with you where we are in our planning for the return to school. Our plan's not yet completed for the full plan, and it will be presented to school committee next Wednesday night. But tonight's part of that process to be able to gather more information and then share more information in detail next week. So this presentation this evening, we're going to touch upon what we've been doing as part of our feasibility study, and how that includes facilities, transportation, spacing and buildings and cohorting of students, as well as when we think about the cafeteria, some survey data that has been really instrumental for our subcommittees that have been planning and meeting daily, weekly throughout the summer so far, and continue to still have much work to be done. We know that all of our planning process continues to be guided by, very vigilant monitoring of our public health data in Massachusetts. And we're encouraged that those indicators about the virus continue to move in the right direction, particularly in Foxborough. At the same time, as we think about what we know at this date, the information that we've gained from you as parents through the multitude of surveys, the first being in June, with our remote learning survey, and that was presented at school committee with the results there. More recently here in July with transportation surveys and intent to return to school. That's been really important for the subcommittees that have been meeting weekly. Those subcommittees consist of school facility operations, auxiliary programs when we think about athletics or music or extended day for the middle school and then elementary schools. Transportation, definitely the health, wellness, and safety subcommittee, which is working in coordination with the department, the Board of Health here in Foxborough as well. Academics, teaching and learning, and supports for our whole child personnel and union leadership. When we think about parents and the part that you play in providing information for those subcommittees, although you've not been on specific subcommittees, we've been collecting your feedback through the multitude of surveys, which by gathering those voices through that data, it's really been critical to the committees that have been working together on all aspects. And then at the same time, we have many of our own faculty members that are Foxborough parents, our school committee members, and certainly the multitude of people that have been really good to reach out and provide information to us as we are planning for what is something that we never imagined. And we know that while our educators and our families worked incredibly hard last spring, that if we find ourselves in a remote learning situation moving forward, that it's going to be something that's very different than what we experienced during that, as we refer to it, the emergency learning period of time. So it's an understatement to say that during this very challenging time period, that we also know that no matter what plan that we end up finding ourselves in when school returns, we're not going to be able to please everyone. But the most important piece to know is that it's the safety of our students and our faculty and our staff that's our primary concern, and we will continue to monitor that throughout. So at the same time, you're probably aware at this point that the Massachusetts Department of Education has asked us to provide 3 different plans, meaning 3 options for serving our students in our schools. a full return, which is obviously our goal to have all of our students back. We know that we cannot replicate what we do in the school buildings at home through remote, and that certainly was very clear last spring with what took place. The second option would be a hybrid model where you would have essentially half of your students in school and half of them remote at home. And then the third, if we were to find ourselves in the remote learning, full remote learning situation that we found ourselves back in the spring. So with that said, I'd like to talk a little bit about our facility study and what we learned through that, because we are looking for a safe return for as many students as possible, and in order to maximize all of our learning and students' holistic needs. And that is clearly driven by the health and safety of all of our students for in-person learning this fall. It's also grounded in the most up-to-date scientific research, and then obviously discussions that come through medical advisors. And so all of our plans are driven by that. When we think about the operations side of things, what we have to look at is when we think about the CDC and providing social distancing for students and trying to restrict movement to be able to meet the optimal of 6 feet of distancing for students, that has been a lot of discussion, a lot of layers that probably you wouldn't even imagine when it comes down to the physical measurements of furniture in classrooms. At the Department of Education, as well as the American Pediatrics Association, they've said in combination with other safety measures that a physical distancing of 3 feet is safe to do if students are wearing masks. So grades 2 through 12 would be required to wear masks with staff as well. That hand sanitizing that would take place in every single classroom with strict cleaning protocols, and at the same time, limiting and cohorting students to limit movement for contact tracing is important. So with that, you could have students safely back in school at 3 feet, with the optimal being 6 feet. So as part of that feasibility study, we have literally gone through and measured classrooms to see if we can have students at a full return to be distanced at that seat at least 3 feet of edge, the edge seat. In order to do that and accomplish that in our classrooms, it's a matter of, in many cases, taking tables in some instances and replacing them with desks to be able to have students to spread out. They would have to be all facing the same direction. And then we have to think about our classes themselves. And if we have a larger class, particularly when we think about some of the elective courses at the high school, that we would be able to move them to a space where we could distance them if the classroom were not able to accommodate that minimum of 3 feet. So we have physically been measuring classrooms, looking at desks, thinking about tables. When we think about the cafeteria, you have to be able to take your mask off to eat, to be able to be 6 feet away. We have round tables to be able to accommodate students full in person in the cafeteria. You're not able to do that with the current 3 lunches as an example that we have. So at the middle school, we have to look at things where we're splitting lunches between classrooms and the cafeteria, looking at the high school, looking at other physical spaces that we could use, adding an additional lunch in order to be able to meet those guidelines. So spacing on large groups like cafeterias is something that's definitely been a challenge. Thinking about transportation, the guidelines are that we can only fill a bus basically a third of the way full, which is essentially 27 students on a bus. In Foxborough, students that are within a mile or more, that's who we transport to school. The state law is actually 2 miles. To have full students return, we obviously would not be able to have all students ride the bus in order to meet that 3 feet, because it's essentially 1 student in a seat on the bus unless they live in the same household. Then it comes to cohorting, and that means thinking about our students to be able to restrict movement. For example, when we think about 5th and 6th graders, having them in the same classroom and not switching classes, instead having the teacher move to the classroom. 7th and 8th grade, you're not able to cohort them and restrict the movement as well because of just the nature of 7th and 8th grade and moving for content areas. But restricting them within the houses is something that where we can minimize movement. At the high school level, based on having multiple grades in courses, for instance, when you have ninth graders, it's not just ninth graders necessarily in a class. And that's especially true when we think about 10th through 12th grade and the departments themselves. You're not able to cohort students at the high school. So the physical movement around the building are things that we would have to restrict when we think of hallways as an example. Tape in hallways where you're on one side of the hallway and you're moving. One of our subcommittees, which includes membership from the Board of Health and Deputy Tom Kenvin, in looking at, well, when we're moving through hallways, is it safe for students if they're having to pass each other in a hallway? And the answer is yes, because of wearing the mask and you're not congregating in a hallway. You've got the movement, but at the same time, we would be making markers and signs and restricting to one side of the hallway. If you think about the middle school, you're thinking about separate stairwells and movement throughout the building. So the cohorting of students themselves is not as easily accomplished at the middle school or the high school, really not at all when it comes to the high school as what we would be able to do at the elementary level. So as part of that feasibility study, it's also all of the cleaning protocols that we follow. And we've spent a lot of time, we have specific protocols with state and federal regulations that we follow, but it also incorporates things like electrostatic sprayers to be able to quickly in large spaces disinfect and clean areas. So if we have students that are moving after the end of the day, being able to do that daily, and then at the same time, having our custodial schedule change based on being able to hit the buildings and clean them more so than what we would have on a regular school year schedule. So the feasibility study involves many different layers, and the cleaning itself looks different based on the circumstances that we're living in, and then also providing masks for all students, where students would actually be as part of back to school supplies to bring their own masks. But if a student didn't have a mask, we would have one for them. And then again, looking at the spaces, if we have classrooms that need to think about larger spaces. Some of the guidance that we do know at this point in time, when we think about chorus and band, they are not able to be inside for classes. They would have to be outdoors. So we're looking at outdoor spaces at the middle school and the high school to be able to still hold those programs that are so important to Foxborough. You would certainly be able to have things like percussion and piano and orchestra inside. So that's part of the feasibility study too, and looking at all of the guidance that's come in from the Department of Ed and how can we meet those requirements so that we have safety as far as, again, our number one priority. So I'm going to pause there for a moment and see if Mr. Yukno wanted to add anything from a facility standpoint, and then if we had any particular questions that's more on health, safety, and facilities.
So I think some of the questions that came up earlier, the school department has been very proactive since the spring in buying PPE products. And so we're actually, we've been very successful with a number of vendors to build up a pretty good supply of disinfectants and, antiseptics and wipes and gloves and pretty much everything on the list of things that we need to supply. In addition, we got on the bandwagon very early on. We had years ago bought a couple of those disinfectant machines, so we knew how they operated. We have now put ourselves in a position where every building not only has the regular hand disinfecting units, but we also have backpack versions, which allows us to go through buildings much faster and still have the same success rate as far as of getting the product out onto the touch surfaces and making sure that they're clean. All of our chemicals are either OSHA or state and federally monitored, and for the most part, most of our chemicals are green chemicals that all meet the requirements for the 99.9% of bacteria and virus killing. They are all products that are typically used in hospitals, nursing homes, and schools. None of our products would be considered caustic. We're not allowed to use those and haven't been for years within the school districts. So that's not even an option for us. We will be putting up our kind of our procedures thing for cleaning, where talks about the high touch points that we'll be dealing with. It lists the chemicals that we actually do use, and one of the questions I believe that came up was on the MSDA sheets themselves. We will have those available, but again, because we are controlled on the state level, we are very we're not even allowed to use anything that would be something that would be caustic in nature. So, and really it has been that way for years for schools. So nothing has changed because of COVID-19. It's all, that's pretty much standard. So buildings, not only the custodians are going to go through additional training that has already been set up that will show them how to use all of the appropriate equipment, as well as the disinfectants. Obviously, they've been using a lot of the disinfectants ever since the spring when this first started to come across, so they understand what the process is. Our buses also have equipment now that between runs can be, the buses can be disinfected as well. And as I said, as far as the ability to have antiseptic, on each bus and in each classroom, we've been able to acquire the necessary supplies for that as well. So I think we've done fairly well in those areas, and we're fairly comfortable that we will have the appropriate products as we open up.
Mr. Yukna, can you speak a little to the cleaning in between classes and how that would, you may have said it and I might not have been able to hear you. Did you cover it?
No, in the elementary, it's a very different process than on the high school and the middle school. So on the high school and middle school, quite honestly, because there is movement between classes, there is no way for us, if you think about a building like the high school, which has 60 classrooms, to have custodians go through each room in that 10 to 15 minute break. So we would be doing typical things where there will be wipes within the classrooms that a student can take and wipe down their area as they enter. I think most people would feel more comfortable doing their area rather than hoping that the person before them did it. So again, every classroom will have that available to them. We're not anticipating or expecting the teachers to do it. Again, they'll be moving between classes as well. They don't typically stay in one classroom either. But again, it's kind of like no different than what you see today, whether you go to Stop and Shop and take the disinfectant to clean the cart as you're moving. We all do it, and we all know that that's part of the process now.
Are there any other questions related to facilities, Dr. Mello?
Not really facilities. There's a few questions about the cohorts. Do you want to hold those or do you want to talk about those now?
Let me answer one more question, though, that we had earlier, and I think maybe some will have. A lot of it comes around the fresh air and the intake and the HVAC systems within the buildings. I think most people realize that our schools are very clean in general. We've done a very good job with that over the years. But our HVAC equipment also is going under thorough cleaning processes. We've gotten much better with that over the last few years. But this year we're taking a renewed look at, the way we clean, whether it's, return vents and fresh air vents coming in. Also, our equipment is all designed with fresh air intake levels or dampers. And typically whether it's the winter or the spring, you're running with those dampers open to some degree to allow fresh air into the buildings throughout. Under the COVID-19, the dampers, which typically might be open at 20%, will maybe at times be open as much as 100%, which brings in a lot more fresh air into the buildings through the mechanical systems. The other side of it is most of our classrooms actually are controlled by what we call univents. And those units are heating units that are actually built into the exterior wall of the classroom, and therefore are also connected to the outside and have dampers in them as well. So the classroom is not dependent on a unit that's 100 feet away on the roof pulling in the fresh air. The classroom itself is bringing in the fresh air through those univent systems. And again, we've gone through all those. They have their own filtering, filters, which we've been replacing on a regular basis. We are increasing the number of filter changes that we will do in this coming year. Typically, it's twice a year. We'll be doing them at least quarterly. during the school year. And the filter level also is something people seem to have some concern about. Obviously, the MERV rating of any filter, the higher you can get on it, the better you can overall. But typically in commercial and school settings, which is different than residential, which obviously, because our filters are very large filters to start with, the high MERV level filters that you could typically get for a home are not as easily accessible on what we call the commercial size equipment. So, would be in the probably anywhere from 7 to 11 MERV level in most of ours, and that's why we feel it's more important to replace them more often. But again, if your systems are working properly, the filters themselves will be collecting the impurities. No filter, whether it's a MERV 18 filter, is going to take out virus related germs because that's not what they're designed for. They're designed to take particles out of the air. So they will slow moisture things moving through, but they're not made as a total changeover. We are also looking at an added feature that especially in the high school and the middle school, because they have the larger units in many areas, of adding UV ray systems within the ductwork itself. And so we've actually started that process already. Again, it's an added concept that does kill virus germs that are moving through ductwork. So we feel that that's the one area that we can make an improvement above what we normally would do.
Mr. Yukna, can you also talk about custodians and how we're handling the custodial staff?
In how we handle it.
The question is, will custodians be given extra hours or additional head count for after school hours cleaning?
Yeah, so our basically we're going to have to adjust our schedule so that typically in any of the buildings we would have a custodian on, one custodian on during the day. The majority of our custodians are on at night, and that's to do the deeper cleaning at night throughout the building when nobody's in their way. Obviously, in this environment, we're going to have more custodians on, at least 2 on during the day to be able to go through the touch points like bathrooms and stuff on a more regular basis. And as far as added custodians, we do have, and we are looking at the ability to hire a few additional custodians to get us through this time frame. We do have what we call our temporary ones that we bring in when custodians are sick. But we could also lean on them to be give us more hours during the either night shift or day shift, as appropriate. So this obviously, and there will be overtime obviously for our staff. We know it's going to be one of our expenses in this whole area that, we do need to do as much cleaning as we possibly can throughout the process.
There's a couple of questions about students. If gloves will be available and wipes will be available. Yes, we will have those things available. I think we could move on to the next.
Okay, so I'll just go back to the cohorting of students, because actually we're using that term for two different in two different ways. In order to maximize space in order to reduce the number of students that are commingling, if you will, with other students in classrooms, we talk about cohorting students, meaning they stay in the same classroom. They're assigned to the same desk and they're not moving from classroom to classroom. I mentioned that a little bit for grades 5 and 6. So we're able to have self-contained classrooms. We're, as I said before, not able to do that as much at the high school level for sure. What we'll talk about here in a few minutes when we talk about the 3 different plans that we have to put forward to the Department of Ed, one of those plans is that hybrid model where you have half your population in at a time while the other half is remote learning. That's the other cohort model that we'll talk about as far as how we group students in order to have students at a reduced capacity in our buildings. With that said, the information that we've been able to gain from all of you through the surveys has been really important, particularly when we think about transportation, knowing that we could only have a third capacity on our buses to transport in, because that makes a difference of how many students obviously can sit on a bus. And that if they're sitting in the same seat with a sibling, that's okay. But other than that, it really comes down to about 27 students that can ride a bus at a time. The advantage of being in a hybrid model, you've reduced your student population in half, and where we've discussed at school committee that we currently bus at the 1 mile mark, that it could mean going to a 2-mile radius in order to be able to have our riders, based on the transportation survey as an example that went out to parents, that said out of those that ride the bus, 75% of them would continue to ride the bus. So cohorting, as we talk about within the building, but at the same time, we'll talk a little bit more when we move into the different models of return to school year plans. The last thing that, and forgive me if I repeat myself on some things, sometimes I say something in the earlier call that I may think that I didn't say, so please be patient. We will have hand sanitizing stations around the building in all strategic locations. They'll be in every single classroom, so that's part of the health and safety as well. When we think about particular activities that take place at the upper levels, we think about cooking classes, and we think about labs and extra precautions with gloves and masks and goggles that would be in place for students to still be able to participate in those important hands-on activities, but at the same time maintaining the distance that they need. When we talk about the hallways and walking through, again, taping off areas so you have walking on one side of the hallway versus the other. When we talk in our subcommittees with the Board of Health and from the safety standpoint, is it okay for students to pass each other in the hallway if we're not able to keep them in a self-contained classroom? And the answer to that from them is yes, it is, because you're passing, you have a mask on, you're not congregating for 10 to 15 minutes in a particular area. So those are all things that are really important to consider when we think about all of the other pieces of wiping down desks, as Mr. Yukna said, between classes, or hand sanitizing in every single classroom. And then when we think about bathrooms being cleaned a minimum of 4 times a day, and the high contact areas for cleaning throughout the day, as we talked about the custodial schedules. So the health and safety considerations, there's many that are there. We also will have a separate area by the nurses office. So if a student does come down and have any kinds of symptoms that they're not feeling well, they'll have a waiting room, if you will, they'll be able to go into, so they're not being exposed to other students. Again, would be wearing a mask. But that's going to be a really important piece for students to stay home if they are sick. We know in the past, maybe, I think I feel okay, or I'm not sure. It's going to be really important that if a student is sick, to stay home, more so than any other time period based on what we have taking place. But again, it'll be a separate area. We have very strict protocols that we have to follow. So if someone were to come down with any of the symptoms, or if someone were to come in contact or be exposed, all of that is very strictly guided in what we need to do with different scenarios. And if we had someone to be exposed to someone else in a particular situation, then the contact tracing is what's so important. And that's why the more that we can limit the movement, the better. As far as other safety, I'll continue to move on, Dr. Mello, unless there's other questions that we need to talk about.
I think there are a couple about cohorts that speak to what you're talking about. So one is about 7th and 8th grade students. Would they be moving classes, or would they be assigned to one desk like 5th and 6th? And also, would they be able to carry backpacks with them to limit time at lockers? And can they carry hand sanitizer?
I don't know if Ms. Frazier, if you want to speak a little bit, because you've been doing a lot of planning this summer and the differences between 5th and 6th and 7th and 8th.
Sure. So yes, we're going to keep the 5th and 6th graders in the classroom with the teachers moving. The structure of their schedule is very different from the academic schedule in 7th and 8th grades. So as Dr. Berdos mentioned a little bit earlier, we are looking at, or actually we've already worked to place all of the classrooms for each house very close in proximity to limit the movement of the students. But in 7th and 8th grades, they will be changing classes. As far as backpacks, we did talk about, the time at the lockers not being 15 minutes, and therefore not really being an issue of contact for contact tracing, but we are in discussion about maybe it makes sense for the students, at least for the beginning of the year, to be carrying their backpacks to class and having everything with them and bringing it back out. Although no definitive decision on that just yet.
There's another question here that I know we don't have a decision on this yet, but I think it's a fair question. Will 5th and 6th grade classrooms be cohorting based on neighborhoods and bus routes, or will our children be able to blend with students from other districts? For example, would my incoming Taylor 5th grader have the opportunity to be in class or cohort with children coming from Barlow or Igo, or will they be placed in the cohort with children they ride the bus with? And there's a similar related question to, are we considering families and cousins and things like that? So I can tell you the thing we do know for sure is siblings in the same house will definitely be cohorted together. Beyond that, I think it's still up for discussion, but anybody, please feel free to jump in.
I think one of the questions was hand sanitizer, if they'd be able, that was the other part that wasn't answered. Yes, they would be able to have their own hand sanitizers too. As far as the bus routes, the busing of students is something that is a really, there's a lot of work that goes into what that will look like, particularly if we were to find ourselves in a hybrid model and then taking the ridership of buses, because we would have to even reroute. So I don't know that we can answer at this time exactly what that would look like with those bus routes, because we're going to have to plan for what the bus routes would look like if we were busing at the 2-mile mark. We will have to plan if we were in a hybrid model, then would we be able to continue and stay at the 1-mile mark and what that looks like. So there's a lot of variables that go into that. I don't know, Mr. Yukna, if there's anything else that you want to add to that, but I think that it's just safe to say that we don't know exactly what the ridership will look like, and it will vary depending on model with multiple plans in place.
Yes, I think the question actually was referring to if they were on different buses, would they potentially be in the same classroom so that they would be seeing kids from other buildings? And the answer is yes. There's virtually no way for us to keep all the kids on bus 1 in one classroom, because as you can imagine, they're on 4 different grade levels. They're spread across. So it is highly likely that students, even if there's only 12 kids in a classroom, that they're going to be with students across the district and communicating that way. So it won't be so isolating that they're just strictly with the ones that they're on the bus with. So I think that was the question that they were trying to ask.
Before you go further, I just want to answer a couple of easy, quick questions. Information about the disinfectants, yes, we can make that available. We have that. Are we coordinating our plans with other local districts? We do talk with them very often. There are challenges and each unique need of each community that may prohibit them from being exactly the same, but we are in constant contact with many of those districts. And have we thought about using our outdoor space? Yes, we have, for various things. I think this question is particular to Chorus, but yes, we are trying to be creative about using our outdoor space as well.
And then I'd just like to touch on technology for a moment. One of the things that really made it difficult in the spring was that we were not a one-to-one district, although we were a bring your own device and have many, many labs within each of the schools. And of course, we'd never imagined that we would have been out of school for a quarter of the school year that way. So in preparing to find ourselves in a possible remote situation this fall, we have purchased laptops through the CARES Act funding. And those laptops would go home with students in 5th through 12th grade. They would be assigned a laptop. And those are rugged and durable laptops. They actually have touch screens, and they're more as far as some of the features than you would have in some other devices when you think of like particularly a Chromebook. We would also have procedures for students in signing those devices out, having some digital citizenship and responsibility training for our students, at the same time also having some for families to be able to provide you information with technical resources and what students are using. A single sign-on for the programs that we use is something that we heard loud and clear that it could be very confusing for students to have to go to many different places. We would also have content filtering in place. We'd be purchasing that for each of the devices. So that's to keep kids safe at home in the internet, where it just wouldn't be able to allow them to go anywhere by having that content filtering. And then the other piece is the collaboration. When we think about having all of us here this evening, you can see many of us on tiles. With Microsoft Teams, it was only at the 9 tiles. We do now have WebEx. So that has the capability of providing many other resources to us besides just the collaboration part with seeing multiple students and a whole class at a time. So that is ready. We've been using that this summer with staff, and we will have that for students to be able to use as part of whatever plan we fall in. Because at the same time, whether we're full in person or we're hybrid or remote, to be able to use the devices and to use them in a way that it becomes natural and a part of our teaching. We know that teaching has really changed forever based on what we've been experiencing. And so having where we're working that muscle and we're using it from a curriculum side more so by them having their own device, it really opens up possibilities for us. I don't know if there's any questions on the technology side.
I don't see technology. If it is, I'm missing it. I'm scrolling through the chat. There are several questions about temperature checks, which I know is not what you're talking about, but the Mass Department of Ed has not recommended that. I know we have not done that for our summer extended school year program.
Okay, then I'll move to the next topic area, which are those three models: the in-person, the hybrid, and the remote learning. In-person learning is obviously what we want. We want to have our children back in school because we know we can't replicate that from a distance. And following all the guidelines and the social distancing, we know it's going to look different for sure if we're back. And we're planning, for that. But we also know that return to face-to-face instruction just really can't be duplicated. And we'll be better positioned to address the learning gaps from the spring, being able to see our students, assess where they are, to be able to remediate where we need to remediate, and accelerate learning in areas by seeing them face-to-face. Because we know that teaching and learning is most effective from a curriculum academic standpoint, and then the social emotional aspect for our students, because we know the social isolation that took place during the closure. So the downside is that you're wearing a mask and you're wearing a mask all day, but that's the preferred, to be able to have our students safely but back in our classrooms with us. The hybrid model, which is the combination of both. In all of our subcommittees, we've had so much discussion on what would be the best model. At the same time, we recognize that circumstances for families and our staff members, that they're very different, and there's not going to be any plan that ultimately will satisfy everyone. So what can we do to, in the best interest of our students and meet their needs to where we feel is best for them? So we've been really working diligently on that. You may have heard for some districts that went out and announced that they were looking at a week on, a week off. We had a lot of discussion about that, where you would have students, half your students in for the week while the others were remote learning, and then that would flip. We don't feel that this is the best plan for students. When we think about something even as simple as February vacation or April vacation, transitioning back after that can be challenging. To do that every other week makes it even that much more challenging. At the same time, going back to the mental well-being of our students, being in school as much as possible is what is really best from everyone's standpoint. We want to be able to be there to meet their needs, to be able to have our eyes on them, to be able to work with them face to face. So the social emotional piece of being out for a whole week and then in for a whole week, we didn't feel that was in the best interest of students. You also have the potential for additional learning gaps. One of the things that came out loud and clear from our parents in that first survey out in June was the engagement factor and how difficult it was to keep students motivated and engaged. We do also know that part of that was there wasn't the accountability as far as grades, where it was a credit and no credit, and clearly it's going to be very different. There's going to be attendance for every class. There's going to be grades that are issued. So it's going to be very different than it looked in the spring. But at the same time, you do have that potential for additional learning gaps if you're out for a whole week, because the motivation it might seem to wane. So then our discussion moved to a split model, to where how could we see our kids more regularly and not have 5 days away from school? So then we looked at going back to that word cohort, an A, B, C model, A would be if you had students here for 2 full days. On the alternating 2 days would be the B cohort, with 1 day that's fully remote, where you could bring the A and B cohorts together remotely. So if you think about a Monday, Tuesday, a Wednesday being fully remote, a Thursday, Friday. The discussion with our teacher return to school work group, and well, what is the better plan to have an AA where it's the same cohort on Monday and Tuesday, then everyone remote on Wednesday, and then the other cohort Thursday, Friday. Our work group felt that it was more important from a curriculum instruction and a social emotional side, to have our students in an A-B model, to where if I'm in cohort A, I'm in school fully for the full day on a Monday and on a Thursday. If I'm in cohort B, I'm in school fully for a Tuesday and a Friday. The opposite days would be remote, and then the Wednesday remote with all groups. The cohort C is when we think about our students in specialized programs, and those that have really felt the impact even more by being out of school from the special education standpoint, as well as our English learners. So cohort C students would be in school full time each of the days. And that is very specific to students and the programs that they are in. So that is the model that we feel would better meet the needs of our students if we find ourselves in a hybrid model, to where they're not going to be 5 days out of school. We can see them more regularly. It provides opportunities for instruction, to have reteaching opportunities where you're not waiting for longer, and you can catch students and the questions that they have and the needs by having them in every other day versus 2 days in a row. The third model, which is completely remote, as I mentioned before, it's going to look very different. It's not going to be the same. Everyone would have their own device. Again, it's going to be synchronous with live instruction, students checking in for classes, and the accountability with grades that would be there. At the same time, we know that students to be glued to a computer for 6.5 hours a day is not what's optimal either. So yes, you would have live instruction, but at the same time, you would have opportunities where you're working on things that's not where you're staring at a computer screen all day. So the full details of what that would look like, we will continue to work through that. But the important part, I think, for planning is that at the secondary level, it would be an A-B full day remote Wednesday, A-B Thursday, Friday. I will mention that when we think about meeting the needs of students in our classrooms, we know that students all have very different needs. Just as a one-size approach doesn't fit in a classroom with a teacher, it doesn't fit when we think about the levels in the hybrid model. So our elementary model would look different than our secondary model for a hybrid. Elementary, when we think about the developmental needs of students, it's to be what's developmentally appropriate. In order to have students here every day, we think that's most important. So the elementary model, although we're here for secondary, is a half-day model where students are here in the morning or they're here in the afternoon, and the opposite part of that time is with specials such as music and art and world language and wellness, but they would have their core instruction face-to-face with their teachers and would be in classrooms every day, providing for the consistency and continuity. Because when you think about a kindergartner or a first grader being completely out and remote, that it's challenging as it is. It's challenging for everyone, but really trying to do what we think is best for students, we felt as though that an elementary versus secondary model would be different.
We have a couple of questions, Dr. Bertos, around remote learning and technology. A couple that I can answer quickly. If we were in a full remote learning model, would teachers be teaching synchronously on a schedule? Yes, if we were fully out. We did license all students and teachers on the WebEx platform, which allows a greater level of security for students and teachers. If it was on the hybrid model, they would be teaching and interacting with students live on days they don't have students in their classroom. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that. And parents are wondering how their students will be cohorted.
So as far as the model, the days that they're not in school and the other students are in full-time with the teacher, you're not able to do two things at once. But at the same time, we're looking at ways to be able to have that connection to where you could have some kind of a synchronous opportunity at different times. But you're not going to have the teacher that's with all of the teachers in the classroom at the same time teaching all of the students at home at the same time synchronously. But what are the opportunities that we can provide for some synchronous periods of time? That is all to be determined. And I missed the second part of the question.
It was about how students are being cohorted.
That's the tricky part. So we looked, initially at the alphabet. And so that is what you think might be really simple. And it might not be at every single grade level. It's the same way. For instance, if you were to divide cohort A to K by last name, and then the other cohort thinking about an alphabet. It's not as easy because just where last names fall at times. So we try with the first pass that way, but then we have to go back and really look at classes, because particularly when you think of electives and courses at the high school, it might be that we need to think of a different part of the alphabet or think about scheduling a little bit differently, say for 9th grade versus 10th through 12th, just depending on the numbers and how they span. So hopefully it's more alphabetical, but at the same time, it's not a perfect science either.
One other unanswered question regarding technology, since we passed that already, and Mr. Yukna or Mr. Heyer may want to take it, was about the arrival of the laptops.
So we did work with a number of vendors, requesting proposals from them. One of the specifications that we inquired about was lead times for delivery. Right now, we're being told that our equipment should arrive in New Jersey for ground transportation the end of August, the very end of August. Again, so we're working with the vendor to be able to get those in to us as soon as possible and get them distributed to teachers and families.
Thank you, Mr. Heyer.
Okay, so one of the areas that we wanted to touch upon is special education, and that you've heard me reference cohort C for students that would be some of our most at-risk students in specialized populations, and that they would be in full-time each of the days. But then there's also a very big difference in what took place for special education in the spring versus what it would look like in this next school year if we were to find ourselves in either a hybrid or a fully remote plan model, that is. So I'll ask Mr. Michael Lazik to just give a little bit more information that's specific to special education. And he's our new Director of Student Services.
Thank you, Dr. Bertos. So first and foremost, I think we can all agree that the students that were most affected by this closure was absolutely our students with disabilities. And so back in the springtime, when we first originally closed, the state pretty much created two categories. One was resources and supports, and the other was instruction and services. And those two areas combined would satisfy the requirement of FAPE. The state has made a big shift because of this extended period of time, but where we're going to focus on strictly instruction and services. And so, like Dr. Berto said earlier, our students with complex and high needs, we're recommending that they attend full-time in person 5 days a week as they require and need those types of services. And then at the next level, we have students with moderate needs. And so it's our job to provide all services as the state's advised in their July 9th guidance to all districts, that we are to provide all services that are documented in the student's IEP, and whether it be a remote model that we go into, a hybrid model, or a full in-person model. And so when it comes down to the hybrid model or the remote model, our teachers will be trained in teletherapy services, and it's similar to telehealth, and that is a way for students to receive their services if they are on the hybrid model, as far as speech and language, occupational therapy, any other of those related services, counseling as well. But it's really important that I think the big piece of this is the parent engagement part. Not only do we need to meet the needs of our students, but we also need to meet the needs of our families as far as our scheduling of services and when they happen and when they'll take place and where they'll take place. So I envision at the start of the year that each special education liaison will be directly in contact with parents and to identify through a individualized student learning plan. And what that will encompass is what services will be provided, when they'll be provided, and by who they're going to be provided by. So we're going to be very, very regimented as far as how those services are provided, because we need to ensure that all students require these services, but we need to ensure that they're receiving these services throughout the week. And so, like I said earlier, it's not a one size fits all. So our students with higher level or complex level of needs that are in our sub-separate programs or our specialized programs in district, we're recommending that they attend 5 days a week because they require and need those services. In addition to that, students that are if we do go into a hybrid or a remote model, will still receive all of the services as prescribed by the IEP. And it's our job as a district to ensure that we're able to provide those services in-house, and if we're not able to, we'll have to contract out for those services, but we want to ensure that we have a model of service delivery that meets all needs of all kids.
Mr. Michael Isaac, you may have said this, I may not have heard it. For cohort C students, does this include going to school on Wednesday?
Yes.
And then a related question, not for you, Mr. Michael Isaac, but a general question. What about Monday holidays? Would one group miss more school than others? We actually looked at this. There are 3 Monday holidays throughout the year, so we didn't think that the impact was significant.
Dr. Mello, was there any questions in regards to special education that you can find?
Just let me see. I do see a question about the 8th grade accelerated math class still meeting at the high school. Yes, that is the plan. Start dates, there's a lot of question about start dates. We do not know that yet, and that will require a vote by school committee. Scrolling through, there's 96 questions here, so I'm just checking how. I'll come back to it, Mr. Michael Isaac. If I find a question, I will just interrupt Dr. Berdos and we'll go back to you.
Thank you.
So touched on at the very beginning a little bit was, which we know is a big question mark, and that's athletics. At this point in time, we know that athletics are not supposed to start, they cannot start before September 14th. And the next week and a half to 2 weeks is our understanding that we will have a decision on fall athletics. So we don't have an answer at this point. We do know for music that, as I stated in the beginning, that band and chorus cannot take place indoors. So we've been coming up with outdoor spaces in order to have them 10 feet spaced. And if it's inclement weather, then the curriculum would change to such that we could be inside still working on the curriculum itself. It would just look differently. So we're adjusting our curriculum. Same goes when we think about wellness and being outdoors, what we can do outdoors, if we need to be inside in the gym and spaced out by 10 feet, how that can change some of the things that we do. So there's a lot of planning from the curriculum and instruction side in order to still keep those programs that are so important and not have them suffer any more than they would end up because of these more restrictive guidelines of the 10 feet of distancing. So that the outdoor spaces, looking where we can have those at both the Ahern and the high school, is something that we're knee deep in with the planning there. And the athletics, waiting on that. One thing as far as band, where we have the summer program in the summertime that usually happens, that's not able to start. But we're also, when we think about marching band as an example, but what can we do? So there's things that we can do virtually with the drum majors and with the music educators. When we think about marching, well, how do you read a drill and how do you march? So being able to do that virtually is really important, not to lose that. So we're being really creative in how we can still meet with students in a virtual environment when we can't have them out on the field at this point in time.
I did find a question for Mr. Michael Isaac. What differentiates a student with more significant special education needs that would be in cohort C versus a student with moderate special needs that would remain in cohort A or B?
That's a really good question. So piece of the state's guidance was looking at something called the level of need. It's our placement form. It's our third. It's called PL3. It's a level of need, and so it's really depending on the level of services that a student's receiving. So if a student's receiving a high level of services on that placement form itself, it would identify a student as a high needs student, and so that is one area that we're going to focus on. Just like we have students in our specialized programs that necessarily aren't considered high need via the IEP services. And so that is something that we're going to have to make a decision on with the team. But if a parent or guardian feels that their student requires a higher level of service and needs to be in school a lot longer, that's a decision for a team. Like I always say, in special education, it's always a team process and it's always a team decision. And so if parents or guardians feel that their child needs more services than they're receiving because to be honest, there's a lot of, with the school closure, there could be additional needs that these students require when they come to us in other disability areas that we're not even aware of yet. And so I think when students arrive to us and we collaborate in contact with parents and we have those meetings and have those phone calls, that is a team decision that if a parent feels that their student needs to be in cohort C to receive those types of services, we will make that team decision at that time.
Thank you, Mr. Michael-Isaac. Dr. Burdos, I'm going to turn it back to you. A lot of the questions are not related to special education right now.
Okay, are there other questions? I think we've gone through the topics that we intended to go through. So if there's any ones that we need to circle back to.
Okay, another one that is somewhat related to special education, although it's a regular education initiative, is will students with 504 plans still receive the same the support that they need?
So in their 504 plans, if there's a set of accommodations, of course, they still have the right to those accommodations. And for those 504 plans that may have services in those 504 plans, we're still required to give.
So they would not be considered cohort C?
Correct. No, they would not.
Okay. Thank you. There's a lot of people in the chat acknowledging that this is the challenge for schools and thanking us. I just want to acknowledge that and thank you for your support of us as we continue to engage with all of our stakeholders and work through this. There are questions about students who might have pre-existing health conditions and what we would do for them, which would be a remote learning option. There's actually several questions about remote learning options, Dr. Burdos, if you want to talk a little bit about that. Parents wondering if they can opt for that.
Yes. So, and we did in the survey that was sent out to parents, we saw a number of parents that were interested in full remote learning because of having underlying health conditions, either with the student themselves or family member that they live with. And then at the same time that some just not being comfortable with the 3 feet to 6 feet distancing and preferring remote learning. So the Department of Ed has been working to provide a learning management system, an LMS, which has all of the content to where students would be receiving their remote learning through this particular program and platform that would be aligned to state standards. And that's something that we would have to purchase per student who chose that full remote learning. The important factor here is if a student went for a full remote plan and we're purchasing that for them, and then we were to find ourselves in a full remote situation, they would still continue with the remote learning plan that is being provided through this LMS because it is independent of our teachers, because they wouldn't be providing a full remote learning plan while they're either full in person or in a hybrid mode. We're still waiting for specifics on that. We were actually on the call with the Commissioner of Education today, who had said that in the next couple of days, we will learn exactly, looks to be 2 different platforms and what they are. We have some experience with students when we think about virtual high school as an example. Many students will take online courses that way. So I think that's one of the easiest way to think about it, is that you would have your courses online. They would be paced by the student. It's not going to be with one of the Foxborough teachers. And again, we're waiting on more specifics on that. But for those families that chose the full remote learning, then we as a district would be purchasing that license subscription for those students.
Back to Mr. Michael-Isaac for a moment, and you may have touched upon this, but I can't hear as well. How will the district handle re-evals for special education students? Did you cover that?
Re-evals in regards to over the during the school year?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Re-evaluation testing during the school year?
It just
Is that
says,
what-
how will the district handle reevals for special education students?
Sure. So, I'm putting together a care and safety plan when it comes to special education testing, and what that will consist of is a set of policies and protocols that staff will have to follow when it comes to sanitizing, when it comes to the actual evaluation, and it comes to all aspects of testing. But we will still be absolutely doing all initial and reevaluations as we would during a typical school year.
Thank you, Mr. Michael Isaac.
Welcome.
So there's a question here. Well, it's a comment. It's great to get a single sign-on, but what will be done to consolidate all the different tools? So I can tell you our teaching and learning subcommittees have been meeting weekly, and we have been really focused on streamlining the applications that we use. So for example, assignment submission will be Teams. It will just be through that specific portal. So we are making decisions about all teachers trying to streamline and use the same platforms so that it'll be very easy for parents and students. So there won't be a question between one teacher and another teacher, that it will be consistent. And that's actually coming from the teachers as well as you. So that's great. People have asked for the brand of laptops. They are Lenovo laptops. I think we'll talk in more detail about the model and what they look like next week at school committee. What will the start and end times be for the half-day sessions at elementary? That will be talked about on Wednesday, and I can try to answer that in the chat for you. Let's see. People are wondering if the day is affected, the start and end time of the day. I don't know if you want to talk about that, Dr. Bertos?
The beginning and end time of the day would be the same.
So Dr. Mello, one of the other questions I see here was, in addition to laptops, what other technology upgrades are planned? So we are expanding our digital learning footprint and opportunities for students. Some of the upgrades do include new Wi-Fi access points and additional internet bandwidth and capacity in the school buildings, digital learning and remote support software. In addition to some of the instructional technology and digital learning enhancements that you'll see, we're also investing in digital technology to support our educational operations for improving communications, such as a mobile app, such as technology for the scheduling of substitute teachers and communicating with parents about student absences.
Thank you.
And the device is a Lenovo 300E. It's a tablet 3-in-1 convertible device, and it will be running, it's a Windows-based device.
Thank you, Mr. Heyer. There's a lot of questions about people seeing in the news that our school year has been reduced to 170 days. I don't know, Dr. Bertos, if you want to talk about the impact of that on our start of school. People are wondering when we're starting.
Sure. To hear that we had 10 days that were added at the beginning of the year was something that was a surprise to us. And we heard from the commissioner that's to be, if it's in place, it's at the beginning of the school year. Our calendar is a function of school committee vote. So that'll be a discussion that takes place at school committee as well. If the start date, where it's right now at September 1st, it clearly will be impacted by that. But to give the exact start date at this point, that will be a discussion at school committee.
There are some specific questions about juniors and seniors, particularly seniors. Special consideration for them. Have we thought about making them a cohort within themselves? How are we considering any special things for them? That might be a better question for Ms. Myers-Packler.
I'm making sure I'm unmuted, as I have a tendency to stay muted as I'm talking. Good evening, everybody. It is something that we are talking about from the guidance level, through teachers, through administration, on what can we do for all of our students so that those experiences that we always want them to have at the high school level, they can have. So just one quick little example, we are trying, again, on all levels to have those experiences. A senior cohort, as Dr. Mello had just mentioned, is not really possible. Our students are selecting electives, particularly at the senior level, that could have students that are in grades 10 through 12. And to reconfigure any of those is really a daunting task at this point. But we are looking at doing things. Perhaps one of the things that our seniors have looked forward to is the credit for life that we have done. And we were actually just talking this week about the possibility of that becoming a remote concept that we could do in small cohorts of seniors, because that has been a senior activity. Other things that we've taken a look at too, we've done a senior safety day as seniors are getting ready to leave the high school and to go on to whatever they plan to do after their senior year. And once again, how could we possibly maybe do that remotely or in smaller groups and still give those opportunities as we go along? We are looking to have activities if we're back. We will be taking a look to see how those can happen. If we are in a remote or a hybrid, we will be looking at how can we manage these things remotely as well, so students can come together in other capacities, or perhaps in the smaller groups that they might be able to meet live.
Ms. Myers-Pakla, along the same lines, any considerations especially for freshmen?
Yes, thank you for that too. I did see those questions coming up. Our freshmen in particular, like our seniors and others, have lost out on some things that happened in transition. I know our 4th to 5th grade, I believe, would have done the same. And that's that whole step up day. So we do have a virtual, or we do have a virtual tour that will be coming out and will be live. We are working with our link crew leaders to see how we can transition our freshmen in September to allow them to have that opportunity to come in. So we are working on plans. So if you do have a 9th grader, please stay tuned, because we will be sending out information regarding freshman year and that orientation in.
Thank you. Can we have just a little bit more information about the days when students aren't in school, what that would look like for them? So for example, Wednesday would look different interactively than it would on if I'm a Monday, Thursday student, than on Tuesday and Friday. What does it look like? There's several questions in the chat about that.
Our team is working on plans so that when students are live in with a teacher on a hybrid, then on the days that they are out, it would be that extended period, and teachers are planning for that. If in that hybrid, we do have a day that is a remote day, totally remote for our students, we would be looking to bring both of the A and the B students back together again, because again, our hope would be either we're coming in with everybody, or at some point during the year, everybody will be back together again. So that's that opportunity for questions, for dialogue, for interactions to take place on that.
Thank you.
I saw one question in the chat, and the first part was thanking all of us for all of the work. So thank you for recognizing that. But it had to do with alerting parents if there were someone that was considered symptomatic or tested positive. Communication is something that is going to be critical. We did a lot of communication for the spring, with weekly letters, and at some points people felt like we communicated too much. But communication is going to be critical as we move forward with anything that takes place in a classroom with parents, within a school, and we will be communicating weekly, and it will look differently than it has in the past because of the circumstances that we will be in, and there's strict guidelines and policies, again, that we have to follow based on this being a pandemic and the sickness for our students. At the same time, I think I said it before, it's really important for parents to partner with us. If your child is sick, for them to stay home. And that is really going to help with any kind of transmission. And at the same time, we're going to be looking at, contact tracing. So it's so intricately twined between classrooms and cohorts and movements that it's going to be safety's number one, and that there will be a lot of communication that takes place.
To that point, Dr. Bertos, I think what came up in the last session that I think is important is you're getting a lot of information right now to process, and this still is in the development stage, and we're hoping to have a more fleshed out picture for you. Well, we will by next Wednesday for school committee. There was a question, will you have another opportunity to give feedback? Absolutely. We will be sending additional surveys and seeking input as we continue through this process. And as information becomes available, we will continue to communicate it out with you. So there will be more to hear next Wednesday at school committee, but there will also be follow-up from another survey, so watch for that.
And I would just like to also add that, so the school committee votes on how we reopen schools based on one of these three models. But at the same time, we have to go with the science and watch closely of what's taking place in Foxborough, and context is really important. So we could see that we have one plan that we are going forward with after August 10th that has to be submitted to the Department of Ed and school committee, obviously voting next week, but that could change at the end of the month and based on what's taking place. We've been really fortunate in Foxborough and meeting with the Board of Health to learn that since March, there's been 128 cases of COVID in Foxborough itself. And currently right now, there's 7. And that's a really low number, and it's wonderful, and we're going in the right direction. So we need to watch that, and that's obviously going to inform where we go from here. But I think it's really important to know that with all of the planning that we're doing, that it is subject to change. But we feel as though if if we find ourselves in a hybrid model, what it could look like, then that's going to be more helpful for families. But again, as I stated before, we know that there's not going to be a perfect plan. We're in unprecedented times, as we've said over and over, and we're trying to solve problems that we've never been presented with. And there's many, many challenges that go along with that. But we're really fortunate with all of the people that are working really hard to solve those problems and answer the questions that we can at this point in time, and appreciate your patience as we learn more and can answer them going forward. So thank you very much for taking your time this evening to join us on this. We will take the questions that were within the question and answer, and that will help us as we present more information and share information with you going forward. So unless there's a final thread there, I want to be respectful of people's time and before we close out for the evening.
I think I do want to be respectful of the time, and it is getting late. As I said earlier, this chat will be collected. So questions that have not been answered, again, we will see what we can answer, either communicate that back to you, use it to inform our school committee presentation, which will be next Wednesday at 7. And I know that people will continue to reach out with their questions. So we will do our best to get all the information that we have out to you just as soon as we can. So thank you so much.
In a safe summer, and we will continue to be in touch. Have a good night.